Good morning. This is Mary Tressel, and I'd like to welcome you to our webinar today, Bring Your Own Device, Creating Internal Controls for the Millennial Workforce. All right, first I'd like to walk you through using your webinar pane. You'll see the webinar pane in front of you. Please note that the orange arrow will allow you to minimize or maximize the pane. If it is minimized, simply click on the orange arrow to bring it back. Feel free to submit any questions that you have throughout the webinar, and our presenters will answer them at the end of the webinar as time permits. Okay, and we want to make sure that you have your audio settings set correctly. So if you're using your telephone to listen in, please select Use Telephone. If you're listening through the computer speakers, please select Use Mic and Speakers. If you have the incorrect settings selected, it will produce an echo sound. Our first presenter today is Jeremy Suharski. He's a consulting director here with Armanino and has over 12 years of experience in audit support, internal audit, and process optimization. Jeremy leads our governance, risk, and compliance practice, and his background includes helping companies optimize their compliance programs, and he does that through a unique approach of controls and processes should strike the proper balance between the need to protect a company while not being unduly onerous and restricting their ability to innovate. That is particularly relevant with today's topic. Our second presenter is Steve Schaffner. He's a senior manager with Armanino and has over 16 years of governance, risk, and compliance experience. Steve has performed various types of IT governance, risk, and compliance audits, financial statement audits, SSA 16 and SOC attestations, disaster recovery and business continuity planning, risk assessments, SOX compliance audits, security controls testing, and others. So during today's webinar, you will learn how to review the trends that are associated with the millennial workforce, discuss how Bring Your Own Device is enabling this workforce. You'll learn about the top risks associated with BYOD, and you'll also evaluate options for mitigating risks associated with BYOD. And our presentation is going to cover the millennials, who they are, and how they are changing the modern workplace. Bring Your Own Device basics, the drawbacks and benefits of this. Bring Your Own Device risks and how it may harm your organization. And internal controls for BYOD, how you can mitigate risk and empower your workforce. And with that, we are going to enter into our first polling question. All right, so here's the question. True or false, there are more connected mobile devices on the planet Earth than there are people. All right, and we've got a few people answering. We'd like to have all of you submit your answers here, and then Jeremy will give us the surprising answer here, I think. Okay, great. The majority of you have responded, so we're going to open it up and let you know the real answer.
Excellent. Good morning, everyone. This is Jeremy Suharski. First and foremost, thanks for taking time out of your morning to spend some time with us to learn about Bring Your Own Device. So the correct answer here is that there are, in fact, more connected mobile devices on planet Earth than people. That threshold was passed in 2012. And that's according to a Cisco Systems survey. And it's interesting, if you look at the trends associated with mobile devices, they continue to be one of the fastest growing areas of technology throughout the world. And the projections are that by 2016 there will be 10 billion mobile devices connected globally, which effectively is about 1.5 devices per capita. And so this is probably something that I would bet you're seeing, whether it be at home or in the office. It's very rare for an individual to have just a single device. I know that many of the individuals on my team and here at Armanino will go to the office or go to a client with a laptop. They'll also commonly have a tablet, possibly for taking notes, and then of course they've got their smartphone for keeping up to date and up to speed while they're out in the field. So the reason we started with this question was we wanted to kind of frame sort of two different pieces of the puzzle and then show how they're converging. The first is the proliferation of mobile devices. This is something that is really, really significant that's happened really over the last 5 years, really with the advent of the Android operating system and the rollout of the first and then subsequent iPhones. The other piece that's really driving this trend, this movement towards BYOD and mobile device management, is a significant change in how the millennial workforce is looking to perform their work on a daily basis. So the first thing we have to look at is, looking at some of the different individual traits associated with millennials. And really what we can do is start by looking at what is the evolution of the modern office. On the left there you can see kind of the baby boomer generation. For those of you who are fans of Mad Men, it probably looks a lot like Sterling Cooper, Draper Price offices. It was very, very manual. It was very phone and face-to-face intensive. You fast forward, a number of decades, then you've got the Generation X generation who have this sort of cubicle, Dilbert type of dwelling with the, the desktop computers, doing more through email and doing more virtual communication, if you will. Now, the millennials, and millennials are defined as any individuals born between 1982 and 2000. Their workplace is very, very different. They're going to be working in very open environments. It's not uncommon for them to have, work from home arrangements or be working remotely through, Wi-Fi connections, etc. So mobility has become a significant influencer for this generation. Laying on top of that, what is the technology that's been enabling these generations, and really how is it relevant to the mobile device discussion? When you look at it, baby boomers had, kind of the mainframe computers, those computers that filled up an entire room yet had a fraction of the processing power that your smartphone has today. You fast forward a number of years to Generation X, and we had desktops, and then finally moving into laptops where, a significant majority of the clients that we work with don't have desktops in their environment anymore. Everybody, regardless of position, now gets laptops. Now, millennials are starting to change that, where they're wanting to have more preferences or more ability to decide what devices they choose, and many of them are moving more towards truly mobile devices, those that are interconnected not only through Wi-Fi but through cellular connections as well, 4G connections, etc. So tablets and smartphones really are becoming a significant preference for those individuals. So you might be asking that's great, but really how are they changing business? And this is really where sort of the intersection of technology and the generation preferences really hits. They commonly will have unconventional work schedules, where in the past it's been very much a 9-to-5 or an 8-to-4 type of work environment. It's not uncommon for me to see, and I see this at a lot of my clients that employ quite a few millennials. You'll come in at 8:30, 9 o'clock in the morning. It's going to be a ghost town until about 10 or 11, but you're going to see people at the office until 8, 9, 10 o'clock at night. So very unconventional work schedules. It's very much an anytime, anywhere, which is why mobile comes right along with it. These individuals want to be able to sit down and connect and be productive at any point in time. The other area where BYOD and mobile device management becomes very key is this preference for mixing business and personal use. If you think about when the first BlackBerries came out, it wasn't uncommon to see an individual with two phones either in their pocket or on their little belt holster. You'd have your BlackBerry for business use, and then you might have your personal cell phone for personal use. That doesn't really happen anymore. You're going to be mixing a significant amount of business and personal use. The other thing that I find intriguing as well is millennials have a strong preference to, not a strong preference, they don't see a strong need to be in the office on a regular basis. Again, ties directly into mobility. Key point as well from a security perspective, they view it as it is IT's responsibility, not their responsibility to enforce security, and when it comes down to it, they're going to step around IT policies if necessary to get the jobs done. And a key piece here as well, they commonly use multiple devices, as we talked about. Just even here at Armanino, we see a lot of individuals who will have their primary laptop, but also have the capability to do certain functions through tablets or through smartphones as well. And last but not least, millennials, compared to other generations, don't care quite about privacy as much. It is less of a concern if you look across a lot of the surveys that have been done in this space. They've grown up in a world that the internet's been in their home since they were born, where some of us did not have that till high school, college, or beyond. So from a privacy perspective, they're far more attuned to having personal data readily available on the internet, and they are not as concerned with employers or the general public having access to some of that information. Last but not least, one of the things that we're seeing as well that's also driving this convergence of technology as well as the generation gap is this idea of an any-to-any mobility world. And that's really where we want any device to be able to connect at any time. And if you look at some of the statistics that are out there around how many devices are currently connected to the Internet and where we're going, not only with mobile devices, but any type of connection. If you look at a recent Cisco survey, they point out that only 1% of things are currently connected to the Internet. And so they define that not only as things that are hardwired, but mobile devices, anything that could have a connection. And they're predicting that over the next 10 to 12 years, that's going to rise significantly to really to be in the quadrillions of devices being connected. So if you can imagine not only mobile devices, but any type of mobile technology, whether it be components of your car being connected to traffic grids for real-time updates, et cetera. This move towards mobility and connectivity is going to continue to move forward. It's going to continue to change work preferences, and it's driving a significant shift to BYOD, and it's really something that companies no longer have the choice to overlook and really need to start to embrace and look at in a very serious way.
Hi, everyone. This is Steve Schaffner. It's interesting, Jeremy, when you talk about the explosion of mobile technologies. If you read some articles, they expand on what that's going to look like. So you gave some examples of cars and traffic alerts and other mobile things. Things in your house are also going to explode in terms of connecting to the Internet. I read an article recently that talked about, right now we have our cable boxes and some TVs plugged directly into the Internet. In the future, they're saying your refrigerator at home will plug into the Internet, and with RFID chips on food products, it will tell you when your milk is spoiled or things need to be replaced. So it's really growing, and the interconnectivity of everything is going to be exploding in the future. With that in mind, let's take a look at what adoption rates are specifically for BYOD devices. So when we look at those devices, I think most people normally go to smartphones and tablets, and that's certainly a big part of it. But that also includes laptops, right? So I can bring my personal laptop from home, and if I don't have good controls around how we connect to the network, I can put in the wireless password, and voila, I've just bypassed a lot of endpoint security by doing so. Depending on the survey that you look at, we see rates ranging from 40% to about 75% in terms of the adoption rate of these devices. So the graph kind of shows that and gives you an idea. Let's take a moment right now, if we go to the next slide, and do a survey of the folks on the phone and on the web. So we have another polling question. It's going to pop up. Do you allow employees to connect personal devices to your corporate network? So let's see how you stack up against the surveys.
Great, and we have about 2/3 of you who have voted, so go ahead and register your vote, and we will show the results momentarily. Okay, great.
Is that good? So let's put that up. So it looks like about 81% of you allow personal devices on your corporate network, and that is an interesting statistic indeed. Curious, how many people do we have on the webcast? About 65 of you, so just to give you an idea of how big the audience is. Great. So as we look at this next slide, this is showing results from different surveys. So I know there's some of you on the phone or on the other end of the webcast here that are looking at the numbers and saying, wait a minute, 75%, 31%, that doesn't add up to 100. So be aware, these are different surveys that we're looking at. 75% of companies allow access to their corporate systems from personal devices, and that matches our poll at about 81%. Less than half have well-defined access policies for those devices, which is a concern. 58% of companies do not have proper policies in place to manage those devices. And only 31% of companies, per a different survey, prohibit personal devices on their network. And of all the companies, and we see this a lot in the course of what we do, about 24% make exceptions for the executives. So we may have strong policy that allows or disallows it, but usually the executives drop in and they just got their new iPad and they want to be able to use it, make it happen, and because of their position, we make those exceptions for them.
And Steve, that's a great point, because that last one around making exceptions for executives is something that I personally have seen in my client base. We've done some work for a client over the past handful of years related to information security, and one of the key things we pointed out was making sure that they had a robust data classification and BYOD process and controls in place. And unfortunately, it didn't get a lot of traction with the executives. There was this sense that we're going too quick, we don't have time to slow down. Very interesting, because about 3 months ago, in the course of doing some work, it was brought to our attention that the CEO had inadvertently left his personal iPad on an airplane, and that contained quite a bit of sensitive information on it. And when we dug further, there was no additional software layered over that device to help protect it, and there was, in fact, not even a PIN code to protect, at least at a cursory level, passersby from trying to access that device. So I think that's really one of the key risks, and jumping ahead just a touch, we will touch on key risks, but I think that's one of the biggest things companies need to be aware of, is that executives will come in, and it's very difficult to say no to your CEO or your CIO or your CFO because they are an executive level individual, but also recognize that needs to be balanced with the need to protect the company and its assets.
Mm-hmm. And I think that's a great example, because oftentimes right now, where we are in time, a lot of CEOs and C-level people are maybe the least tech savvy among the entire corporation. So, there's pros and cons that go along with giving them access.
Yeah, absolutely.
Great. So our next slide here, we wanted to give you a couple of examples of companies that have adopted BYOD programs, and just a few of the points about each that I think are interesting. So the first one, Cisco, they began their BYOD program 2 years ago. Cisco obviously is a natural candidate to be an early adopter by the nature of what they do. They're very big on networking. In their program, they've seen a 79% growth rate in the number of mobile devices. That's huge. And keep in mind, that's the growth rate, not the adoption rate. So in the last year-ish, they've seen 79% growth. In 2012 alone, they added 11,000 smartphones and tablets. And of those, smartphones and tablets. And then in addition, there were 14,000 iPads. So that's tremendous growth. Now, Pandora, for people that aren't familiar with them, they're an online music streaming service. It's really a cool thing. If you haven't checked them out, you can give them some preferences and the type of music you like, and they automatically pick songs and do a pretty good job of ferreting out what you like based on what you tell them. In their corporation, they allow employees to buy their own devices, and that should be BUI instead of UI. But the point there is they give their employees a stipend. The employees go out and buy whatever device they want, Mac, Apple, whatever, and they bring it in. Now, that's a natural advantage for them. By nature of their service, they want to make sure that it works on many different devices. So it's a competitive advantage for them to do so. They've also learned some other things as they've gone down that path. They pay for data usage regardless of the purpose, and so as a result, it actually lowers IT costs through the whole experience. This also helps them, again, as a strategic point to account for rapidly changing technology. So keeps them on the forefront, keeps their product supportable for all the different people that use it.
And a really interesting point there, Steve, with Pandora as well is another point that we hadn't made yet up to this point is, with this idea of having BYOD and mobility, et cetera, the other sort of shift in technology, if you will, that really is enabling a lot of this is having so many corporate systems now reside in the cloud, where a lot of these systems traditionally have been on-premise, housed in your own data center in a co-location facility. You would need VPN technology to access them. You look at some of these younger companies like Pandora, likely a lot of their systems are going to be SaaS-based, whether it be your ERP, your financial software, your CRM software, et cetera. So you really just need a browser to get to it. So having a full BYOD program like Pandora is very much supportable in a very straightforward way when you have a very, very minimal footprint in your own data center. So that's another thing that I want to make sure we pointed out, is that is absolutely fueling this as well.
Yeah, and one final point on Pandora and the way they've approached this. When you give your employees a stipend and say, go buy your own device, and by the way, that's going to be your device, there's no capital expenditure on the books for Pandora. So it helps them in managing their overall finances as well.
Absolutely.
Back to you, Jeremy.
So we've talked a lot about kind of some of the nuts and bolts of BYOD and shown you a couple good examples of corporations that have adopted it. We want to dig into some of the benefits and some of the drawbacks associated with each. Some of the benefits, are increased productivity. Intel did an internal survey, and they felt that the increased productivity resulted in an additional 56 minutes of productive time per day for each employee throughout their organization. So with a company that large, you can imagine what that's going to look like in terms of driving additional innovation, additional results, et cetera. I think really some of the benefits that were going to be less tangible than that. I think it's touching on some of these additional points here. Selection of desired technology. I think everybody has their preference for what type of device they like to work with, whether it be a Mac or a Windows device. I think is probably the primary debate. Everybody's got their preference. And really what that ties into is the next point, which is your lower technology training costs. Think about an individual that has been working on a Mac their entire life. Macs are very, very prevalent throughout the education system. So you come up through, grade school, middle school, high school, college, et cetera. If you've been working on a Mac your entire life, and now all of a sudden your first employer out of college hands you a Windows device, you may not be as versed in it as you may need to be for some of the more basic functionality. The other benefit of BYOD is it allows you to have significant versatility, and that's really through being able to push out apps and content through any type of device and enable that end user to access things in the most advantageous way for them. From a drawbacks perspective, I think first and foremost, the one that pops to the top of the list is lack of adequate control over devices. It becomes very difficult for an organization to exert the proper amount of control over a device that they do not physically own. It's a lot easier to say we're going to be applying this type of software or this type of policy to a device that you have provided to your employees. Gets into a bit of a gray area, unfortunately, if it's a device that the employee is bringing and then wanting to use to access corporate systems. And one thing to clarify as well when we're referencing corporate systems, it's not simply allowing employees to access a guest Wi-Fi so they can get internet access within your environment. It is getting access to some type of critical system within your environment. It could be your ERP, it could be your CRM system, a variety of any other business applications. So that's really what we're looking at when we say corporate systems. A lot of surveys point out that the costs may exceed the benefits, which is interesting. One of the big justifications initially for BYOD has always been that it's far more cost effective just to let your employees do like Pandora does, bring their devices, have them connected, then provide a flat reimbursement rate for them. However, if you look at some surveys, they show that because of the time that it takes to process additional reimbursements as opposed to purchasing devices individually for those end users, it could actually end up costing you more in the long run. Another point from a drawback perspective is endpoint security, and we saw this initially, a number of years back when Wi-Fi suddenly became relevant and affordable in corporate environments, where it used to be you had to have physical access to the building and sit down and physically plug your device into a cable to access the network. Now all of a sudden you didn't have to be sitting in the building. You could be sitting in their lobby or the parking lot, et cetera. So now endpoint security became more relevant and far higher risk for your laptops. And it continues with mobile devices. These devices can be anywhere, not just connected to Wi-Fi connections, but they could be anywhere connected to any type of network. And now you have to be conscious of endpoint security along with those. One thing that comes up as well with personal devices that's a significant drawback is this question of phone number ownership issues. So for example, if I bring my personal device and access corporate networks, then decide that I'm ready to move on to a different organization, do I have the ability to take that phone number with me, or is it now somehow tied to the organization that I was previously working with? And that can be a bit of a sticky situation. Last but not least, support issues and reimbursement costs. I touched on those previously, that now we've got a multitude of environments, a multitude of operating systems and devices that we need to support, significant number of apps, et cetera, that we need to support. So it can be very, very draining on an IT organization. And then, of course, the reimbursement costs as well.
Fabulous. Let's go on to another statistic here. So why should you care about BYOD? Obviously, we've already talked a bit about the numbers. These are exploding, and so it's going to be coming into your environment whether you like it or not. And this is all very interesting to think that the first iPhone came out in 2007. That was only 5 years ago, and that was really the first smartphone. So in 5 years, we've seen that rate of adoption. It's only going to increase. The sky is the limit in terms of where they're going and how integrated they're going to get into everything we do. Let's move on to the next slide. Well, it's refreshing a bit. So what are the risks? Let's talk about those a little bit, and we've hinted at them. But with these devices, there can be inappropriate content available on site, vulnerabilities associated with apps. So if you bring in a phone, you may have apps that are inherently insecure, and they would allow others to go through that app to get to your corporate data. Productivity and bandwidth drains. So with these devices on site and allowing them on networks, that's going to take time away from productivity. Data leakage and endpoint security issues, I think that's the one that people most naturally think of in terms of what if I lose it, what if it gets stolen. I think the other twist on that is what do you do when people leave the company? If you've allowed data to reside on these devices, and keep in mind we're talking about personal laptops as well, how do we collect that data back if that's what's appropriate when people decide to move on? We all do. We all leave the company. It's just a matter of when and why. Mixing personal data and private data, that's a challenging one. On one hand, you want to be concerned about what corporate data is getting on personal devices. But on the flip side, you also need to think about what private data is going to be doing on corporate devices depending on how you've shifted and shaped your policy. So that's another concern to think about. And then the last main bullet here, bypassing inbound and outbound filters. So when you design a corporate IT structure with a network and all the different devices that you're managing, you usually have some degree of a border strategy. So we're going to manage everything that comes into and out of our network. On the inbound side, we're trying to protect against malware, viruses, things that are going to cause problems, data corruption, outages, all types of bad things. On the outbound side, particularly if you're a company that deals with confidential information, you need to be concerned about what's going outside. So when you bring in a device that you don't own, you haven't configured, it's not necessarily to your corporate standard in terms of security and protections, you have those risks, and those are things you need to think about.
And to Steve's point around risks with mobile apps and data leakage and vulnerabilities associated with those, just wanted to point out one specific example here around mobile app exploits. You've got roughly 800,000 apps available through the various app stores, whether it be on the Android marketplace or through Apple. Those really, depending on the vendor, may have little or no oversight for security, especially if it's an app that Steve and I created as a pet project on the weekend, etc. And unfortunately, what you're seeing more so in the Android space than the Apple space is that you're seeing some of these applications now be injected with various viruses and other types of malware. And one example is the OpFake Trojan, and this is one that Symantec identified and released some information on relatively recently. And what it does, it is a Trojan payload that is attached to an app. Once it is on the device, it will attack Android operating systems and enslaves the device. Basically makes it where you can't do anything with that device. Then what it will do is it'll make calls or SMS texts out to premium rate numbers, which runs up your bill significantly from a cell phone carrier perspective. So you can see just a small piece of code that can be injected into an application that you have on a mobile device can really be a significant nuisance, and it can really drive up additional costs. And this is just one example. If you look at a lot of the security surveys that are available online, they're showing that mobile device security and mobile app security is one of the fastest growing areas of risk that is being targeted by hackers for malicious purposes. And with that, let's pause momentarily for another polling question.
So our question here is, where are you in terms of your BYOD maturity as an organization? First selection, nothing. You haven't done anything yet. The second option is developing. So maybe you're thinking about it. Maybe you're having some discussions. You're probably realizing that this is a bigger thing than maybe it seemed initially. And I'm guessing if you're on this webcast, you're probably, there's a good bunch of you in that bucket. Third one is defined. You have a policy and you have communicated I can't talk. You defined a policy and you've communicated that out to your community. And the fourth option, you've optimized it and you just have it fine-tuned and humming along nicely. Looks like we have about 81%. We'll give it 10 seconds. Get your final vote in. Is that your final answer? Let's go ahead and close it. So the results will be popping up in here. As expected, most of you look like you are developing your strategy. You've thought about it. You're working on it. That's great. 21% haven't done anything. That also isn't a surprise based on what we're seeing in the marketplace. A lot of companies, they haven't done anything yet, and I would say they're probably bridged between the first and second options. They are thinking about it, but they still haven't acted on that.
Yeah, and that top 5% that's optimized, to me that's surprising. I'm surprised to see that number be that high. So for those respondents in that top category, kudos to you for really being ahead of the curve.
Indeed. All right, so since most of you are right at that point, let's talk about where to start. The first thing you need to do is draw a line in the sand. Take a position regardless of what you think that is. And it's interesting because there is no one-size-fits-all response to this challenge. It depends on a number of different factors: what type of company you are, how big you are, what industry you're in, what is your product or your service. The example that I like to use is if you take one basic element, which is carbon, depending on where it is in the scale of what it can be, you're going to treat it very differently. On one end of the continuum, it's coal. On the other end of the continuum, it's a finely refined diamond. I'm going to care a lot more about 1 or 2 diamonds being missing than I am about 1 or 2 lumps of coal. So with that as kind of a backdrop, you need to think about what is the right position for your company, and we're going to talk about the different ways that you might want to think about that. Here's a few different points. How does it tie to your data management? So the trick there is bringing in mobile devices and doing that to get the productivity gains out of it that you're seeking, right? These things have benefit. That's why we love them so much. That's why they're exploding. But by the same token, you have to look at your privacy concerns, confidentiality, other aspects of just managing your environment. So you've got to balance that out. What's the benefit you want to achieve? How will you manage those risks? And the last part is when you make a decision, whatever that is, how are you going to communicate that out to the people who need to know? Let's go to the next slide. So start with people. We're always thinking people, process, and technology. It's a logical starting point. First step, define and communicate the policies for acceptable use. So again, with the different factors we talked about, what's the right position for you? Next, determine what technologies are acceptable or not, and along with that, which ones are too risky.
Yeah, and with one thing I want to jump in here on, Steve, is around defining and communicating the policies for acceptable use. I think this is one where you really want to engage not only your legal team to make sure that if we have a personal device that's coming in, what can we legally do with that device, and what is the appropriate way to communicate those responsibilities to the users through an acceptable use policy. Mm-hmm. But the other thing is you want to engage your end users, because what you don't want to do is put a policy out there that's too restrictive where you're going to get this backlash from employees saying, well, hey, I'm not going to have this device available to me if you're going to force me to do A, B, or C. Mm-hmm. So you actually may not realize the efficiency gain. You may actually have some negative sort of internal press, if you will, around this program that you're trying to roll out that you want to be adopted and supported in a positive way.
Yeah, and you're trying to balance, again, productivity with security mainly, yep, and there's other factors. The example I've seen a lot is with hospital systems. So doctors want these things, and they're incredible devices because they can bring up information, but also images, x-rays, and all the different things that they need. But when you layer on the security that most hospitals want because of HIPAA and other regulations, it gets really tricky, and the doctors push back hard. I'm making life and death decisions. I cannot be hampered with 3 more passwords and hoops I have to jump through to get to what I need. We do want them to have this at their fingertips, this information, but we also need to keep it secure. So that's just one example of how we have to balance these things.
Exactly. And so along the lines of starting off with people, really embracing the change. As I mentioned, you want to engage your end users. So to gather consensus, start with focus groups. Bring some of these individuals in that you recognize are power users, and solicit their input on how they are using their devices, what apps are making their day-to-day work more useful. The other way to do this as well is if you move down the line of rolling out a mobile device solution, which we're going to talk about shortly, you have the ability to see which apps are being installed, which ones are being used. So, for example, if one or two people install an app that looks a little suspicious, you might dig in and ask some questions around that. On the flip side, if you've got 100 or 200 users all installing an app, well, there may be something there that you need to look at from a positive perspective. From a people perspective, user awareness is significant as well. You want to make sure that people are aware of what are their responsibilities not only for the use of their mobile devices, but their role in securing those devices. And again, we touched on the acceptable use agreements and making sure we've got legals buy-in as well. And at the end of the day, the success or failure, if you look at all the surveys regarding and all the literature available regarding successful BYOD deployments, it all comes down to communication, more so than anything else. It's not about the technology. It's not about what mobile device we standardize on, et cetera. It's about communication, making sure that employees understand the direction that you are taking the organization from a mobile device perspective, and then understanding what the drawbacks are, and really understanding management's decision on why the course or the direction was selected.
Oops. So to build on what Jeremy was just saying, communicate, communicate, communicate. After you've decided what your policy is going to be, you've drawn that line in the sand, you need to then communicate it out to the people that need that information. Obviously, I think it's really obvious here, we're creating a policy, so we're going to push that out in the normal ways. We can either push that out in an email, or we can push that out in some sort of training. What you may also want to do, and I think I'm kind of recommending you do, is that you treat it like any other electronic use policy. And normally in those cases, when you hire on, you have to read the policy and you sign an acknowledgement saying that you're going to use the company's assets responsibly. You're not going to send flame mails or go to inappropriate websites, those types of things, because those are risky behaviors. BYOD is now another component to that. So I think that's what makes the most sense, and as a company you get the added benefit of having that signed agreement on the backside acknowledging that they've read, understand, and will agree with those policies. There's other things you may want to include in there, things to make sure you cover. Think about backing up personal data. So the trick there is, if I have a smartphone, and I'm going to talk about an iPhone because that's what I use. On the iPhone with your contact list, for example, when you look at your contact list, and even if you have that phone connected with your Exchange server, say, you're looking at one big list of contacts. But in reality, behind that, you have whatever contacts you've entered into the phone. Perhaps you sync that phone with your personal Outlook at home, and then, of course, it synchronizes with the Exchange server at work. All of those are mushed together in that one list. If the phone gets lost and stolen, the only thing the company is going to have backed up is the company's list. You need to make sure users are aware of their data and that they are not assuming the corporation is covering that. Along those lines, you want to clarify the lines of responsibility for device maintenance, the support, and the costs. So who's going to own the device? Who's going to pay for the plan, the cell phone plan and the data plan? Who owns the data that's on it? And you have to draw those lines between personal and corporate data. You need to examine the types of apps that are out there. I think that was on one of the earlier slides. And let employees know that if you have X, Y, and Z on your phone, you need to take it off. Those are considered risky. You also need to disable access to the network if an app is blacklisted. So there are ways through firewalls and other technology that you can do that. And if you know the device has been jailbroken, if you're not familiar with that term, that's basically breaking out of the manufacturer's system that they've set up. So again, iPhone is an example. There is a way, if you look up the term jailbreak iPhone on Google, there's a lot of websites and YouTube videos that will happily and very conveniently walk you through how to do this. You can actually break the iPhone operating system. Behind it, there's a Linux operating system. That's what the iOS is built on. What that allows you to do is bypass, for example, the App Store. So if there's an app that Apple has not approved, but you want it for whatever reason, you can jailbreak your iPhone. You're basically setting it free from being locked into Apple's proprietary system, and now you can bring in other apps that perhaps are more risky, and that's frankly why Apple wants to screen them all, is to manage the risk and keep their devices useful. Jailbreaking has some other benefits too. You can remove some of the apps that come with the phone if that's what you need. So if you want someone to have a phone but not Safari, you can jailbreak it and remove Safari from it. And then lastly, in your BYOD agreement that you're going to have your employees sign, you want to make sure that they are clear on the consequences for noncompliance. And that's usually some statement similar to many others that, there are penalties that are up to and including termination. Our next slide, as that's refreshing here, as you're looking at the process, it begins with analysis. So the process or the policy that you end up with is going to get input from these three different sources. You need to do a risk assessment. We talked about that just on the last slide, and I know some of the others in terms of these are things to consider. Make sure your policy addresses those relative to your company. You need to look at the different solutions available, evaluate those, build that into your process as well. And the third piece down in the right-hand bottom corner here, IT governance. You want to make sure that just with any other part of your IT operation, you need to have a policy out there so people know what to do. You need to make sure that they're doing that and that they know that they need to be doing it. And lastly, you need to be monitoring to make sure that people are complying with the policy. So make sure as you think this through, you look at it from that angle as well. Let's go to the next slide. So does your process include the basics? And we've hit on a lot of these already, but we're kind of bringing them together in a different slide here, which somebody put a Raider picture on. If anybody knows me, I'm a Niner fan, so let's leave it at that. All right. Don't forget blocking and tackling. So things like enrolling devices. So within your corporate environment, how do you know when they're coming in? How do you make sure that they are authorized? Then you have to make sure that they're secure. So maybe removing some apps, maybe layering in some security software, and we're going to talk more about that more in a little bit. Decommissioning devices on the back side of their device's life cycle, so both local and remote. What that means is if you have a company device or a BYOD device, it's great to bring it in. Everybody wants access so we can set you up. But when you leave the company, not all of us go through the traditional termination process. Some people are escorted out. Some people may be abroad and are told not to return for all kinds of odd situations. I think you know what I'm talking about. So we need to think of that through, and how are we going to deal with data on those mobile devices that are gone when people are terminated. Monitoring, again, governance. How are we going to monitor these devices to make sure they're being used appropriately? If they aren't being used appropriately, how are we going to respond to that? And that leads to the last bullet, the incident response and management process. So you think about BYOD, also think about the infrastructure behind it. Now we have another polling question. Let's go ahead and get that started. On this one, what do you see as top barriers towards adoption? So the first one, is it the skill set, having the right skills necessary to do this? Are you seeing pushback because people want to see the ROI? Is it security? Does your corporation have a lot of concerns about how that will provide or open doors to our data? All of the above, or perhaps 5, you have no plans to adopt it at this time, so none of these are appropriate. I'm seeing an interesting response. Where are we? We're at 57%. Let's do 10 or 15 seconds. I know we're trying to make up some time here, so we'll keep it short.
You mean the top barriers to adopting a BYOD policy, correct?
Correct.
Yes. Thank you. So we're about 82. Let's percent response. Let's get those up. Here we go. So looks like it's all of the above in most of your organizations, which is interesting. Right behind that is security. Next behind that is the right skill set, and that's certainly a valid concern. ROI seems to be the least of the concerns among this group.
And it's interesting, Steve, with security being the second largest respondent category there, that very much is in line with what we see with a lot of the surveys that are out there, whether it be Gartner, IDG, Acronis, et cetera. Security commonly is the largest area of concern because there's a lot of fear, uncertainty, and doubt around how we're going to be managing devices and content and things of that sort. So very much in line with what a lot of the industry experts are seeing there as well.
Great. So with that said, let's focus then on different strategies to address those concerns. So our next slide up, we got it up there. It's native solutions. So when we talk about native solutions, those are options that come on the device that we're talking about. And this is primarily, for this slide, talking about mobile phones and tablets. Right? PCs, I think we're a little bit more familiar with in terms of how to protect them, how to manage those. It's just bringing them into the fold when those are present. For a native device, they usually come with a passcode. So whether it's enabled or not, when you get the device, you have the ability to set up a password before you can get onto the iPhone or the Android device. Those are the two main ones that are out there. Encryption. I know iPhones, the data that are on iPhones, if you have a passcode set up and assuming that people don't get past that, the data on it is encrypted. So even if you went around and got in on the backside, theoretically there's a layer of security based on that. You also want to look at whether the devices provide for a remote wipe or removable media, and those are two different things. The remote wipe allows you the ability to basically reset the phone to its original state. It erases everything that you put on there, every contact, every email, whatever else, and it makes the phone just like it was when you bought it brand new. And BlackBerry is BlackBerry because that was the function, the main function that they offered. That's where they grew. Now iPhones and Androids have caught up, and whether they come with that, I know some have a degree of it now. There are apps that you can layer onto them that allow for that functionality. The last one is removable media, and we don't see that one so much with iPhones. We see that with Androids and some Windows phones, and those are micro SD card slots. And there's two things that you can do with those. One is obviously you can put data on them, and that provides you a way to get that data moved outside of how you control it. It's now on basically a floppy disk, but it's a teeny tiny little one. On the flip side of that, some of those phones, you can bring a benefit through those card slots by having security apps on the card. You put it in the phone, and it provides you then with another layer of security. So you have to look at that from both angles. Cloud drive solutions have some inherent security features. So what we're talking about there is SaaS services, as software as a service, basically things that you use online. And there's pros and cons to them. When we talk about data and where to store it and how to protect it, SharePoint is a great option for doing that. But as many of you probably know, they're very time-intensive to set up. But once they're set up, you can put documents on there. It's usually a pretty slick tool. By contrast, there's other services for file sharing out there, Drawbacks being one. It's a website. It's there. You can use it. It's a low setup cost, but it does require some high maintenance on the backside to keep it secure. So you have to look at those trade-offs. Security, functionality, again, we're hammering that throughout this, and make the right decision for you. So do I need a BYOD solution? Here's another survey result. This is talking in this slide about the strength of passcodes. So keep in mind with Apple devices, the native password that comes on it is a 4-character password, and it's only numeric. So, theoretically you can take 10,000 cracks at trying to guess that code, and you're going to get it because there's only 10,000 possible options. The more you can increase that, the stronger your security is going to be. And then all the other password attributes come into play as well. So numbers, letters, uppercase, lowercase, special characters. The longer you can make it, the more of those things that you can introduce, the more secure your device is going to be. Native security, native passwords is one layer, but maybe for your corporate data and the apps that allow access to that, you want to make sure that incorporates something a little stronger.
Exactly, and that's a good lead into looking at what are some of the enterprise solutions. The last slide talking about native passwords and PIN codes. It's a question that we get a lot from our clients. Pushback. Well, we apply passwords, et cetera, and it's used to illustrate. Really, at the end of the day, it's relatively straightforward to crack a 4-digit numeric PIN. Where you might be going with your BYOD deployment is looking at a more holistic enterprise solution. And depending on the type of vendor, whether you're looking at a mobile iron or an AirWatch or a MAS 360, there's a variety of different layers that you can focus on. Really where you want to start is device management. It's about knowing what devices you have out there and how do you apply the appropriate security to them at a very base level. And that ties into some of the things we touched on that may be available through native technology, but really don't go quite far enough. Things like authentication mechanisms, encryption mechanisms, et cetera. It allows you to have a more robust capability as an organization to know what devices are currently enrolled, and also to have a very straightforward way for your employees to self-enroll those devices. It will install a small app on that device. It will run specific security checks before it allows that device to be granted access to any type of network resources. Once you have your device management capabilities nailed down, that's where you can really start to layer on some of the additional capabilities through an enterprise BYOD solution that's really going to drive those productivity gains you're likely going to be looking for. The first of which is going to be around app management. We touched on sort of the whitelist and blacklist type of app controls earlier. This is where you, as a corporation, have the ability to create an app catalog that is automatically published out to your users. So, for example, if you have key business apps for productivity, maybe Concur for expenses, OneNote for collaboration, SharePoint for additional collaboration, an ERP connector, things of that sort that you have reviewed, that you have tested, those can be put into your corporate app catalog and then pushed out transparent to the user. And then the other piece is you can also make sure that the most current app revision is included on that device. So as additional updates are released, it's not incumbent on the user to go out and download those updates. From there, content management is really where you sort of hit the pinnacle, if you will, of BYOD, and that is where you can create containers. It ties into the next point there, containerization, for personal and corporate data. It really allows you to transparent to the end user, segregate that device to be corporate-oriented versus personal-oriented, and really split that data where it is no longer commingled, and you can facilitate the productivity that the end user is looking for, but maintain control over that content internally. And some of the other components there that you can really tap into as well are around email management and laptop management. There's additional layers that you can add on that help to focus on user management, even to the point of managing browser management. And that's where you can, if you're looking at apps like WebSense or Surf Control, very, very similar functionality for browser management in terms of dictating what users can get to, what they can do, etc. So very, very powerful solutions out there. We didn't want to dig in too deep on here because there's really so many different ways that you can go with this. We also wanted it to be somewhat vendor agnostic. Again, I mentioned there's the Mobile Irons and the Air Watches that are probably the two largest out there, but there's a lot of other very, very robust solutions that will help you achieve a lot of the controls that we just discussed here. From there, one other area that we're seeing BYOD expand to as well, we'll just touch on briefly here, is what's called geofencing, which is using devices and mobile device management technology in combination with location-based services to establish a virtual perimeter where devices or functions within that device will not work outside of a given perimeter. And where this is really being adopted strongly is in manufacturing. So, for example, if you don't want devices to be operable on your plant floor because there could be significant trade secrets, etc., apps can restrict that type of use. The other area that we're seeing it actually is in education. For if you're facilitating BYOD for your students, being able to lock down those devices if they're in or near the locker rooms, etc. So there's no inappropriate use of those devices. So just including this here simply as an area where it could continue to evolve and likely will continue to evolve.
And one more alternative just to consider is a slight twist on BYOD. The acronym here is COPE, and it means corporate owned, personally enabled. What that means is instead of BYOD, hey, user, go buy your own device and bring it into our environment, what the company can do is say, the company has thought through what options are acceptable for that corporation. And then you provide that selection to your employees. So at the end of the day, the employee comes in and kind of gets a menu list. Here's the devices that are acceptable. Which one would you like? Which laptop would you like? Which phone would you like, etc. Now this is good. It provides the end user some selection and they can gravitate towards their preference, but it also allows the company to provide an acceptable layer of security. So this might be a good compromise between all the different aspects we've been talking about today. The other advantage is this approach allows corporations to maintain bulk discounts, both with the device providers as well as service providers when you think about the cell phones and the data plans and those types of things. Most corporations are seeing their costs go down about $80 to $90 a month, down to $60 or $65 a month, down from $90 or $80 a month. So this is an attractive option for many organizations.
Yeah, absolutely. Now we're getting close to the end here. In conclusion, we just wanted to reiterate some of the points that we had here around, how millennials are changing the workplace. We touched on what is BYOD and the key risks. We spent a good amount of time focusing on how we can enable the workforce there. And for any Star Trek fans out there, the graphic we included here, the board resistance is futile. If you look at every survey, if you look at every piece of thought leadership out there, everybody is unanimous in showing that the movement to BYOD is not going to stop. It's going to continue to evolve. And this really is, if you look at the way the workplace is going to look in 5 years, it will not be we're a Windows shop, we're an Apple shop, we're a hybrid. It's going to be we are a mobility shop. And so really this is the direction that all industry is going. And with that, we do have some time for questions.
Great. Jeremy and Steve, thank you so much. It was very informative, and we do have several questions. We may not be able to get to them all on the webinar, but we will respond to you by email if we don't get your question answered. The first question that came in is, we already have a lot of tablets and personal phones in our environment. Is it too late for us to implement a formal BYOD policy?
I'd say it's never too late. If anything, if you know you have it, I think it's almost a requirement. You need to think about how you're going to manage that and, again, get the benefits they bring while managing risk to your organization.
Okay, another question that came in is, who should own the BYOD decision process? Is it HR? Is it IT?
With that one, I think really it's kind of a combination. I think that the key individuals obviously are going to be IT, because they're going to be the ones facilitating the support of whatever solution gets put in place. The other two individuals that I think are key contributors are going to be finance and human resources, because they're going to have the other components around what are the financial implications, what are the cost savings that we're going to be trying to drive, and then human resources obviously around the people side of it. So I think really it's IT with some key supporters along with them.
Okay. Are there any liabilities to the company that come with having corporate and personal data on the same device?
Well, that is something you need to consider. I think that the main risk there is ensuring, again, to the earlier slide, that you communicate clearly with your users about what the company is doing and what the company is not doing. The biggest risk that I see there is that users will come in, bring their personal device, and assume then that if the company has their data on it, that the company is now managing the entire device, and that's not always the case.
All right. Another one that came in is, you haven't spoken about virtual desktop environments and the good fit between that back-end environment and BYOD. So apparently no data is kept on the individual's device, but it is maintained on the server. Are any companies considering this technology in order to enable BYOD?
And Mary, why don't you go ahead and read the next question too, because I think they tie together.
Okay. And then the next question is, we have a concern that when the employee backs up their device, they are also backing up company data. That data is now out of the employer's hands, and in particular, this company has HIPAA data that they're concerned about.
So I certainly have seen that, and the HIPAA reference is good because it goes back to that hospital example I was talking about. Doctors especially love tablets. They're great devices, but they're risky. And the best strategy that I've seen with the hospital organizations or healthcare organizations that I've worked with is to not keep any data on the device. So the apps that allow access are purely thin clients. All they do is present data, and the data itself is all kept on the back end. So back to these questions, the advantage there is that when the user backs up their device, they're not backing up any data. So there's no HIPAA violation. There's nothing there to get outside the corporate control. Yeah, and that's really the big benefit right there.
Yeah, and then also kind of stemming off of that, what I have seen in some environments, some clients is, yes, they are using VDEs or virtual desktop environments to facilitate BYOD more from a data management perspective. So you're absolutely right, that data and those apps are going to be resident on those virtual terminals, but what you're not going to get in that type of solution is the type of collaboration or the type of app support to truly facilitate the mobility that you would want to come along with it. So from a security perspective, absolutely, that's a good way to go. From truly facilitating mobility may not be as useful as other solutions.
Okay, so thank you, Jeremy and Steve. I want to reiterate that we do have a few more questions that have come in, and Jeremy and Steve will get back to you with responses to those. If you'd like to email Jeremy and Steve directly or learn more about Armanino's expertise in this arena, you can certainly do that. Their contact information is on the screen. So we really appreciate all of you participating in our webinar today, and you will receive an email that is a follow-up that has a link to a copy of the slides and the recording of this webinar so you can share it with others within your organization. And as you exit our webinar, please take a moment to fill out our brief evaluation. Your feedback is important to us. So thank you for joining us this morning.